right. Well, for those of you who actually are here, and for those of you who will see this by tomorrow, we hope on YouTube. Tonight we're going to look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 12 through 22. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 12 through 22. In this chapter, Peter has, in the book of 2 Peter, Peter has taken aim at a group of people who are infecting his churches. And these people are the worst kinds of people. They have taken the gospel of Jesus Christ and twisted it into sort of a Gnostic version of Christianity, where what you do with your body doesn't matter. What only matters is that your spirit is good. And so they twist this into advocating every kind of immorality you can think of, and from drunkenness to gluttony to sexual lust, every kind of thing you can think of, and all of it's okay as long as your spirit is good. And Peter, Paul, John, all of them are at war with these people who are threatening to destroy their churches from the inside out. And so let's take a look just at verses 12 and 14 to begin with. But these, referring to these false prophets, as he calls them, like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of these creatures also be destroyed, suffering wrong as the wages of doing wrong. They count it a pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you, having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children. So how does he really feel about these people? So he says they're like unreasoning animals. Another translation might be just brute beasts who are just merely creatures of instinct. They can't think, they can't reason, you can't talk to them. And they have little real value. Their approach to life then basically is suicidal. He says that they are just to be captured and killed like a deer or some other sort of game animal. They will be captured and killed by their own lust. That which they desire most will be, in turn, their destruction. He says that they revile in the daytime. They are reviling where they have no knowledge. Their will and destruction of those creatures will also be destroyed, suffering wrongs as the wages of doing wrong, and they count it as pleasure to revel in the daytime. Most people commit their sins under the cover of darkness, but these people are so bold as to openly commit their sins in the daytime, in full view of everyone. And that's another part of the problem that Peter has, because as a result, he says, they become like blemished lambs. They become stained, he says, stained and blemished there in the middle of verse 13. And so that they are like if you take a lamb or a pigeon to the temple to be offered, it has to be a perfect animal. It can have no blemish. And so these are unfit to offer to God. And they are stains on the Christian church for all to see. They openly identify themselves as a part of First Baptist Church of Ephesus or wherever they may be. And so everyone knows that they're Christian. They're very loud about that. And they commit their immoralities right in the daytime for everyone to see. So he says their deceptions in verse 14. Their deceptions, the end of verse 13, their immoral versions of the church's agape love feast are like skin cancers to the church. Their stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you. So these are people who may walk in as guests for the first time. They announce that they are prophets. So you want to offer them hospitality. You want to give them the opportunity to speak, and they start getting their hooks in that way. Verse 14 says they have eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children. Eyes full of adultery most likely means that these men look at every woman as a potential sexual conquest. That's how they view the world. That's how they see everything around them. And Jesus speaks to the fatal consequences of such sin in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 28 and 29, where he says, even if you look at a woman this way, you're already sinful. You're already committing that sin in your heart. And this is where these people get off the break with Christian doctrine, because their idea is that whatever you do with your body is fine. And Jesus is saying, no, there's a direct connection between what you do with your body and your spirit. Forever, there's been the idea that the eye is the window to the heart. Well, if their eye is always full of adultery, then it's a corrupted heart that only sees others not as people, but just as sort of soulless objects to be used for their own gratification. That entire sentence of verse 14 is largely summed up in one Greek word, paleonexia. It simply means, it's similar to our word covet, but it's stronger than that. It means to desire the things that you have no right to desire. One of the series that everybody watched a couple of years ago was the one about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. It was called The Tudors, Henry Tudor. And evidently Anne was a beautiful woman, and Henry was hard to get along with, and as Henry was already trying to figure out how to get rid of her, others in the court were thinking, well, I think she's beautiful. I think I'll just kidnap her, and she and I'll run away, and we'll get away from the king. And somebody reminded him that would be treason. And so he named about 8 other women that he would happily take. And that same person reminded him that everyone you just named, all belongs to the king. You have no right to any of them or any of the other things that you're naming. We don't think in those terms anymore. And that's to our deficit, because we talk about God being the king and the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. And so this person over here really belongs to God. That's one of the things I remind people of a lot at funerals. We might say, my husband, my wife, but really, he's not my husband, she's not my wife, that's not my child. They always belong to God. They were always God's. There was never a time they weren't God's. First and foremost, they were God's. Who did Jesus really belong to? Did he belong to Mary and Joseph? No. At 12, he gently reminded them when they were looking for him in Jerusalem, well, you knew I would be in my Father's house. Bible doesn't say whether he got a whooping for that. I don't know. But No, Jesus belonged to the Father, but that's no different than any of us. All of us belong to the Father. Jesus said, when you do it even for the least of these, you do it for me. It's as if you are doing it to me. Somebody asked Mother Teresa how many lepers she picked up in the streets of Calcutta. She said, I've never picked up any. And the interviewer laughed and said, oh, come on. She goes, no, it's true. I've never picked up any lepers in Calcutta. I picked up Jesus 4,344 times. That's the thing. That's what we need to remember. That leper there in the street belongs to God. That's how important he is, she is. And so as we look at people, no, they're not just objects of desires or passions of lust, soulless objects for us to use, stairs for us to step on as we climb the ladder of success. These people belong to God. He says that they have hearts trained for greed. Hearts trained for greed. The word here for trained is the same Greek word that you would use for an athlete's training or a soldier's training. And in that time, then, whether it's the athlete or the soldier, not only they are mastering their body, but they're also mastering their fear. And this is what Peter is getting at here. He's saying that these people, their hearts have been trained for greed. Greed has mastered their hearts. So that greed, the desire for the things that you have no right to, the pleonexia, the lusts, the passions, these things have become the master of these men's minds and their bodies and their spirits, to the point that whatever bit of innate decency they ever may have once had has been crushed, absolutely crushed. When you're a history nut like I was from the time I was 5, and a Christian who was, as a college student, on his way to seminary after college, you can't get around the question of how in the world a country like Germany could at the same time be the country that is producing the greatest theologians in the world and at the same time be producing the Nazis. How does that work? Even still today, the best theological dictionary, biblical dictionary you can get your hands on was written by a German theologian by the name of Gerhard Kittel, a card-carrying proud member of the Nazi Party. How is that possible? To have that dichotomy in your head at the same time is very difficult for me. The Germans, prior to World War II, had a much higher church attendance rate than here in the United States. Far more Germans went to church than here in America. And so how is that possible? Well, when you start training, this is what Paul is saying about training his spirit, all those athletic metaphors that Paul uses in his letters. When you start training your mind and your spirit to think a certain way, when you start buying into a certain belief system, even if it's contrary to what you've been taught all of your life, it's almost like you're feeding two wolves. And one's going to win and one's going to lose. And you know which one's going to win? The one you feed. The other one's going to starve to death and die, eaten by the first. And so it's, this is one of the things that I wrestled with for years in order to try to understand what happened. And so here you have the same kind of thing where you have people who once upon a time were perhaps good, solid, decent people. How in the world did they come to a place where not only are they teaching and preaching and participating in this kind of totally upside down message from the gospel of Jesus Christ, but they're luring other people to get involved in it as well. All right, so this is what he's getting at in verses 15 and 16. In verse 15, he says, "Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he received a rebuke for his own transgression. For a mute donkey, speaking with the voice of a man, restrained the madness of the prophet." These false prophets, he says, they are forsaking the right way. They've left the straight road, and they've gone down a bad trail. Now, in Jewish tradition, Balaam, bless his heart, was the poster child for failed and corrupt prophets. You'll find his story in the book of Numbers, starting in chapter 22. The Israelites have come from Egypt, and they finally crossed over into Jordan, and the Canaanite people were not happy with this new addition to their neighborhood. So the king of Moab was very afraid of the Israelites and the alliances that they were quickly making. So he decided that he would summon the prophet Balaam. And he offered Balaam money if he would put a curse on the Israelites to keep them away from his kingdom. So like Peter's enemies, these false prophets, Balaam was covetous. He loved the idea of prophesying for money. The interesting thing is, even though in Jewish tradition he is just excoriated all the time for being such a failed prophet, he never actually took the king's money. He never took a shekel. But it was the idea of the money. If this works out well for me, I'm going to get rich. So it was the idea of the money that motivated him to keep going forward. He went to God, and God said, "No, do not place a curse on them. I have blessed them. They are my people, and the curse will come back on you." But, Lord, that's a lot of money. So he never took the money, but it was all he could think of. Secondly, what he did do is he kind of got around the issue by leading the Israelites to begin to sin with the Moabites. He started introducing these Canaanite, Moabite women to Israelite men. And you may have heard that a lot of the time when a couple goes to church, they're going to go to the church that the wife picks. Well, that was what happened there. And so all of these good followers of Joshua who crossed over Jordan on dry land suddenly are off going after the Moabite women and the Moabite gods. And so he was motivated by greed, and he couldn't curse them. The donkey talked to him, the angel threatened him, but he still managed to lure people away. And it's this luring away from the truth that has Peter so angry. In the end, in Numbers chapter 31, verse 8, it says that when the Israelites finally, as a nation, went after the Moabites, they killed Balaam with the sword. Such people who not only themselves practice the wrong thing, but try to lure people, good people, away, to lure them off the right way, stand condemned by their own actions. So you get down to the end of the chapter, verse 17 through 22, where Peter says these, he means these false prophets, these are springs without water, mist driven by a storm, for whom the black darkness has been reserved. For speaking out arrogant words of vanity, they entice by fleshly desires, by sensuality, those who barely escape from the ones who live in error, promising them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. For if after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and are overcome, the last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would be better for them to not have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow, after washing, returns to wallowing in the mire. Well, again, don't you just wish Peter would just say what he thinks and, not try to soften? These people are like springs with no water. If you're in a desert and you see an oasis, and it's not just a mirage, but a real oasis, and you get there and the spring is dried up, that's awfully disappointing. This is who these people are. They entice and they offer, but they really have nothing of substance to give. They are, he says, like a mist driven by the wind, giving the appearance of being something solid at a distance, but on closer inspection lacking any substance or stability. He says they speak arrogant words of vanity, and they prey on new believers who have just escaped the world's fatal ways, promising them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. Paul, in Galatians 5:13, tells us not to use our freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but rather as an opportunity to serve one another in the love of Christ. Peter here argues that these people are not slaves to Christ, but slaves to their own lust. This is what makes them and their message so arrogant, because they purported to know and teach a way higher than that of Christ. And this is where you get into conflicts with Scientology, with the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and others, because in that sense, they're guilty of the same thing. That was Joseph Smith's whole thing, right? That we've got all of this new revelation of God on these golden tablets, and it's a New Testament, newer testament, and so we've gone beyond just the message of Jesus Christ. We've got something else now. This is what Peter is getting at as well. And he accuses them of being arrogant. He accuses them of vanity, that somehow they know a way that is higher and better than what Christ had to offer. By the way, if an angel gave you some solid gold tablets, would you lose them? I don't know. I think I could keep up with them fairly well, even in the horse and buggy days. This is what they're getting at. The other thing too here, if you were here in church on Sunday, I put up a sign that was a church sign that said something to the effect that God sets us free to obey and serve. There was submit. Thank you. Oh, you were paying attention. That's very good, Len. They were to obey, submit, and serve. And the people on the Facebook page where this came out were just incensed by this. That's ridiculous. How am I free if I'm submitting, obeying, and serving? Well, again, my point on Sunday was that to a Christian, you totally get this. But if you're not Christian, you're not going to understand it at all. It is what Paul said to the Corinthians, foolishness to those who are wise, but yet to those of us who are saved, it is the very, very word of salvation itself. These people don't understand that either. Part of the deal, the people that Peter's mad at, they would be great Americans, because our whole thing in America is individual freedom. Every person is a king or queen of their own castle, right? And you can't tell me how to live my life. You can't tell me how to do this or that. And that's why at this point, you and I have lived long enough to see morality in America completely turned upside down from what we grew up with, because we've taken that idea of the individual being the highest form of freedom quite literally, so that literally whatever you want to do is okay as long as you're not impinging on the rights of others. And that's what these people are saying. Let's just, come on, we have the freedom to do this. The theological word for that is different. It's you are a libertine. It's not that you have freedom. You have freedom to serve Christ. That's what you were freed from sin for. You are not free simply to do whatever you want, live however you want, go wherever you want, do whatever you want. That's not what freedom is. That is the life of a libertine, where you and you alone are the ultimate God that you serve. And this is kind of where these people are, and the enormous damage that can be done. And as I mentioned previously, you see the same kind of damage being done in churches all across America as we keep trying to bend over backwards to accommodate a self-indulgent, individualistic culture around us. So he says in verse 21 and 22 that these people, it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to having known it and to turn away. It's very similar to what Jesus says in John 9, where in the whole chapter of the 9th chapter of John, this is where Jesus heals the man who was born blind. And there's a huge controversy after he heals this guy, because they're wrestling with the issue, who can do this? Because only God can do this. The idea was he's blind because of somebody's sin. That's what the disciples' question was when all of that began. Lord, this man, he was born blind. Was it his sin or someone else's sin? His parents, his grandparents? Whose sin was it? And Jesus dismissed the question out of hand and said, well, it was so that the glory of God could be shown. And he heals the guy. Well, that causes a problem for the Pharisees and the rest of the people there in the temple, because Jesus just did something that only God could do, because he did two things, right? Number one, he healed a man who was born blind. And number two, he forgave him of his sins, because to their mind, the two were one and the same. Only someone who's forgiven could be healed. Only someone who's healed could be forgiven. And only God can do any of that. And so either they were forced to admit that Jesus was God, or this didn't really happen. So what was the first thing they did? Well, it's not really him. It's someone else. It's an imposter. And the guy's like, hey, I'm the same guy that's been out here on these steps for 40 years, for crying out loud. So they bring in his parents, right? And the parents are like, he does look familiar. Yeah. But it's all very threatening at the same time. And so they bring in his parents, and then finally the blind man lectures them. Look, I don't know. All I know is I was blind and now I see. This guy healed me. This guy forgave me. Whether you think he's a god or not, I don't know. And so they come out and they confront Jesus. And Jesus says to them at the end of chapter 9, in verse 41, if you were blind, he says to the Pharisees, you would have no sin. But since you say, we see, your sin remains. And this is what Peter is saying. It would be better if they were still blind. It would be better for them if they had never known anything about Jesus than to see it, to mentally acknowledge it, and then turn away from it as if they didn't ever know it. And so Jesus says, because you say, we see, your sin remains. It's difficult to hold someone responsible for something they did not know or could not possibly have known. But once they know and then deny what they know, that's the problem. Time and time again, Jesus would say to the scribes and the Pharisees who knew the Bible by memory, have you not read such and such? Well, of course they've read it. They've got it memorized. But simply reading it and having it by rote, doesn't mean it's here. And that was the disconnect that they had. That's why they missed him. That's why only one or two of them, like Nicodemus, began to realize who he is. Today, in the world in which you and I live, at any synagogue anywhere in the world, you will never hear a rabbi read Isaiah 53. It will never be read, ever. Why? Because you can't read Isaiah 53 without thinking of who? Jesus. The greatest prophet that the Jews ever produced, Isaiah, keeps saying, that's the guy. And he's saying it hundreds of years before Jesus came. He almost describes him to a T. Well, we can't have that. So we're just going to go from Isaiah 52 to Isaiah 54. We're just going to skip over that. One of the ways that Jews come to Christ is being confronted with everything that Isaiah said, including Isaiah 53. Once you know the truth, it's impossible to deny it without compromising your own integrity. So today's rabbis, like the scribes and Pharisees of old, just turn a blind eye to what doesn't fit their tradition, and Peter's enemies do the same to be able to sell the spiritual swampland that they're hawking. Nothing that they had any substance to it. But this is what they were selling. So they were just going to turn a blind eye to the truth in order to be able to keep trying to sell the spiritual swampland that they were hawking. Like a man in the parable in Luke 11. They're in worse shape now than they were before they knew the truth. And then Peter, in his own gentle way, says, these are just like dogs that return to their own vomit. Or a pig who climbs back into the mud. My grandparents' farm that I spent my summers on up in Tennessee had 2 ponds. The children knew why they were separate, and the animals understood why they were separate. One pond was the pig's pond. One pond was the fishing pond. The children didn't fish in the pig's pond, and the pigs didn't go off and wash themselves in the fishing pond. How we all understood that, I don't know, except probably the pigs were smarter than us kids. When the cows wanted to cool off, they would go into the pig pond, with permission, I guess, from the pigs. And then the pigs would get out in there, they would get all cleaned off, they would get all that Tennessee red clay that was caked on them, all washed off, and then they would walk back over to the other side of the barnyard and just plop right down in the mud. That's just how it worked. It's what they do. And so I know exactly what Peter's talking about, because once you're clean, as a Christian, you need to stay clean, not go right back to the mud that you were in to begin with. At the end of the day, there's really nothing you can do to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. When I was in college, I was a water safety instructor, and I taught a lot of life-saving classes and so forth. One of the coolest things I learned, and I went on to teach, was how if you fall overboard wearing your pants, you can make a life vest out of your pants. I'm not going to demonstrate that here. But I'll tell you about it later if you're interested. Yes, John was already actually demonstrating it. Well done. Because they probably taught that when you were in the Navy, didn't they? Yeah, I would think so. But if somebody really doesn't want to be saved, there's nothing you're going to do to be able to save them. When Jesus is in Jerusalem and he walks by the pool of Siloam and he sees the guy who's been there for 40 years, the lame man who's been there for 40 years, Jesus didn't ask him, "What happened to you?" Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the man said, "Yes," and explained why he hadn't been healed up to that point, it having to do with how the angels troubled the water there in the pool. I honestly believe that if Jesus had looked at the man after 40 years and said, do you want to be healed? And the man said, I'm good. I've been here 40 years. This is home. These are my friends. This is my neighborhood. I really don't know any other life other than this. I'm old at this point. I'm good. But thanks for stopping by. I think Jesus would have kept on walking without healing him. Because Jesus isn't going to force himself on anybody. Nope, you are getting healed today. No, that's just not how Jesus works. But the man said, yes, I want to be healed. And so Jesus healed him. But for somebody that doesn't want to be healed, who doesn't want to be saved, there's nothing you're going to be able to do in order to try to save him. It's the old joke about the guy on the roof when the floods are coming, and a canoe comes by, and a boat comes by, and a helicopter comes by, and he gets to heaven after he's drowned and asks God, I prayed, why didn't you help me? And God said, well, I sent a canoe, a boat, and a helicopter. Why didn't you take any of them? And this is who these people are. Peter's not interested in trying to help these people, these false prophets, because he says they're like unreasonable animals. They just operate on their instincts. You can't talk to them, because he probably had tried already before. What he's interested in is keeping his people away from them, keeping his people separate from them, being able to help them to recognize where evil is and pushing it out of the church. Paul had the same problem in Corinth. Go read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He's dealing with the exact same thing. And churches today are dealing with the exact same thing. We're still dealing with people who, it's all about me and what I think and what I believe. And don't try to confuse me with any of this Jesus stuff. I know what I know. And you can't reason with them. You can't help them. And if they don't want to be saved, they're not going to be saved. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for being with us. And Lord, I pray your blessings. So, Father, give us eyes of discernment so that we see the truth and know the truth and be able to grab on and embrace the truth. Help us to have eyes of discernment to know what is not the truth or who is not the truth as we see it on the internet, as we hear it on our radios and our TVs, however we come across it, to be able to go, nope, that is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. And to be able to just get away from it, back off and run away from it. We don't want to ever feel like we should try to give up on anyone. But Lord, if somebody doesn't want to be saved, if they're so determined to hang on to their individual rights rather than surrendering their life to Christ, until they see just how broken and failing their ideal of the world is, it's not a whole lot we're going to be able to do with them. Keep the door open. When they fall, and when they're broken, and they need healing, that's when they'll come to Jesus, we hope. Or they may try to tell themselves, nope, I'm good right here. So, Father, help us to always keep an open heart and an open door. But they've got to come to Christ. Nobody can come to Christ for them. So, Lord, be with us. Nobody said being a disciple was going to be easy. The boss said, pick up your cross and follow me. And that's what Peter was absolutely all about. So thank you, Lord, for being with us tonight. Thank you for your blessings. Hear us as we pray. In Christ's name.